Economic growth rates in many African countries remain low, adding more pressure to people at risk. And the disparity between the poor and the rich hasn't narrowed. That's according to an OXFAM report released on Monday.
We've got to change the rules that govern how we run the global economy. That's really the essence. We need an approach to running the global economy that does not continue to produce this dynamic where the benefits of economic profit of the economy ultimately accrue to the ones that are already privileged.
OXFAM has come out with a range of recommendations for governments to implement.
We have called and continue to call for the curbing of corporate tax dodging as a key intervention to ensure that we keep money that belongs to the continent in the continent.
Taxation remains the preserve of the formal business sector continentally, but an area that varies from country to country is the informal sector, which is seen as a key economic growth generator, and governments can do more here to encourage growth.
Our informal sector is incredibly weak, so those who are not employed in the formal sector do not have means to access livelihoods, whereas in some other African and SADC countries the informal sector is significantly higher.
The economic growth challenges are fairly universal, but finding the right platform to meaningfully address these matters with developed country leaders remains elusive. WEF is not the platform, OXFAM says.
We really don't think that the group of super-rich countries need to invest to some extent to these regional economic communities to develop their capacity to understand these issues such as tax dodging, base erosion and profit shifting, and also what mechanisms can be put in place to curtail the issues of profit shifting to tax havens.
Many African countries experience unemployment and wage disparity in a similar way, so finding a similar approach to deal with this issue is obviously a prime concern. I'm Angelo, Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's delve further into OXFAM's expectations for this summit. We're joined by Lydia Zigomo. She is the Regional Director for East and Central Africa at OXFAM International. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now let's start with OXFAM's recently released report on wealth, study on wealth levels globally. You found that the inequality gap is widening globally. In Africa, the number of billionaires and wealth has more than tripled. So why should we worry about this trend?
We should worry about this trend because this increase in wealth is not evenly distributed. It's not fairly distributed. So we haven't seen major strides in ensuring that, for instance, our youth unemployment has gone down. We also find that many women are still in very poorly paid, unregulated labor markets, and they are suffering as a result of that. So we see much more vulnerability and inability to handle shocks. This is why we have recurrent crisis in many of the countries. But also such levels of inequality increase the ability of communities in terms of anger and frustration. And that's not a good thing in a country politically, to begin to see levels of frustration and anger increasing. Particularly we notice youth and what's been happening in some countries around that. So that, I think, is one of the challenges of this. The wealth is not evenly and fairly distributed.
Now, of course, the WEF has just kicked off. We're seeing a lot of political business leaders all coming together there. Now, the theme this year is Shared Future and a Fractured World. What do you hope to see come out of this year's summit, especially as it pertains to this issue of inequality globally?
Certainly, we'd like to see things like the gender pay gap decreasing worldwide. We have too many countries, both in the East, West, and South and North, where there's still a gender pay gap. We would like to see more commitments being made. So not so much, less talking and more action, particularly around governments themselves putting in place the right policies and regulations and actually enforcing them around things like basic minimum living wages, which some of the countries in Africa, such as Rwanda, have already made some strides on. And like South Africa has made some strides on putting in place taxation for rich corporates and individuals. So clearly there are some examples of some countries who have actually stepped out and started moving in the right direction. But we need more of the global community to do the same.
And of course, inequality is a huge issue for Africa. Now, at this year's Davos, some believe that the African leaders present will struggle to be part of the agenda this time, given the fact that we have a Brexit, we have Trump in the US, we have greater levels of protectionism when we talk about trade. So what do you agree with this idea that African leaders are going to struggle?
I think there's some truth to that. I think there's so many issues right now on the agenda that there's a danger that if Africa doesn't unite and come with a uniform voice around some of these issues, remembering that we are one of the continents where much of the natural resources that are being mined, extracted and used to fuel some of the industrial growth and development is taking place. But we're not necessarily benefiting. The poorest communities where some of those resources are based are not necessarily benefiting. So I think it's important that Africans leaders really understand that this is important for them. This will enable them to have the revenues they need to be able to invest in public services, ensure that children go to school, ensure that our healthcare systems actually deliver, particularly for women. We've had so many scandals about what's happening in our healthcare delivery systems and how women are adversely affected by that. But also we can actually invest in growing our own markets and trading amongst ourselves as well as with the rest of the world. So I think there's much to be gained for African leaders in making their voice heard, and they will have to make sure that they do it together to be able to have impact, I believe.
Now, this report that came out, a lot of people agree that it's quite an apt time for this to have come out. Do you think that leaders at WEF are going to be interested and keen on focusing on this issue?
Well, we've had people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett talk about the issues of the need for better taxation, particularly of the wealthy. So clearly they are themselves super wealthy, have understood that an increasingly unequal and unfair world is not a good place to be in.
Right.
So I think there's some support for this, and you've heard the IMF also speaking today about the very same issue, and also even highlighting the issue of what this means for women.
Right.
So I think there will be some commitments on this. We cannot have a world, it's unconscionable and immoral that we have women working in garment industries who don't see their children for months on end, women in poultry industry in US of all countries, you know, who have to wear diapers to work because they're not given toilet breaks, and yet they do not earn enough to look after their families. I think if we put people first and we look at people-centered economies, inclusive economies, we will get there. And also, just as a last point, this is all in line with our Sustainable Development Goals. We have made a commitment as a global community that we're going to end extreme poverty by 2030. And the World Bank has already pointed out that unless key actions are taken, this will not occur. And I think, therefore, there's an impetus for action.
Right. Well, we'll certainly be watching the discussions at this week's World Economic Forum. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Of course, that was Lydia Zigomo. She's a Regional Director for East and Central Africa at OXFAM International.